So Terry, I think it's probably fair to say that Adelaide in some ways is a fairly conservative city. These here are some of the pictures that I took over the weekend of the Adelaide Plains as seen from the Mount Lofty summit. One thing that's very apparent from these pictures is this: once you step outside of the central business district, there aren't too many dwellings that stand above 2 stories in height. And as a city, we really haven't been the kind of city that's embraced the high-rise apartments. This may, over time, begin to change. The state government's talking about the transit-orientated development sites, and over time we may start to see more density in certain areas and also higher dwellings as well. But this probably won't happen for another 5 years or so. So we're not building up as a city. The other thing is the state government has also defined very clearly where the urban boundaries are, and quite rightly it's done so to ensure that we don't have urban sprawl. So we're not building up and we're not building out, and we have population increasing probably at its fastest rate that it has in about 30 years. And given the various economic situations that we're going to be facing in the near future in regards to mining and defence, population is probably going to continue to increase. So given that we're not building up, we're not building out, and population's increasing, can you tell us a bit about some of the land supply issues that we're currently facing here in South Australia?
We do need some orderly bringing of land to market just to ensure a smoothness in the price. We don't want lurching of land because it rises or falls depending on a sudden availability of a massive amount of land. I think the industry would favour a relative smoothness in the availability of land and therefore the price points of those lands. We would also argue that the planned or orderly release of land helps in the infrastructure provision. So this issue about how do you create land for people, we see it is important to have some orderly priority of land, and we also see it important that the infrastructure, or the backbone infrastructure we call it, is made available there for those people as a general community asset. For example, we would see that the backbone infrastructure, whether it be water, sewage, electricity, roads, is going to be there for 50 years to 100 years. And most people who buy a house or build a house, first homeowners, are unlikely to be there more than 5 to 7 years, so our statistics show. So we see it as being grossly unfair that the cost of infrastructure, the last on, as it were, was to be borne by those first homeowners who are only going to be in that spot for 5 to 7 years. So we increasingly, when faced with the issue of who pays for that infrastructure, would argue that we would like to see most of that backbone infrastructure paid for as a community asset. In other words, a regulated fee for which the whole community pays for that, rather than that augmentation of infrastructure be paid for by those first homeowners. We see that really adding to the difficulty of affordability, and we therefore see that as being a numbing of growth of housing, particularly for the young and particularly for some of the lower incomes.
But a lot of this major infrastructure that is going in, or that needs to go in to extend the communities out, though,
sure,
that has to be paid from the government, doesn't it?
It does. We would argue it should be. We regard that, as I said, backbone infrastructure is a community asset.
Yeah.
We say that that's what everyone should suffer.
Yeah.
None of us want to pay for it. I guess if we want to be blunt, no one wants to pay for anything. But core infrastructure is something that stays in the community forever, and we would argue that that's just adding to our general community asset, which should not be borne just by the last homeowners.
Sure, and I guess that takes us back to what we were saying before, that really if the government is going to be paying for this infrastructure, they're going to have to get the money from somewhere, and that's probably, I would say, the reluctance of expanding the city.
But we see there's some real creativity that needs to be put here. I mean, there are infrastructure bonds and there are other financial tools that could be used for that. I think the first thing we as an industry are trying to do is to encourage all sides of government to understand what I said previously, that it's a community asset. The core infrastructure should be there to make available the opportunity for housing, which is just part of our community asset. We see growth as being very important in South Australia. To not have increase in growth with our ageing population over the next 20 years, we're going to have 20 to 30 odd percent, or more than that actually, 20 to 35% of our population aged over 65 in the next 20 years.
Yeah.
So that's a real issue for South Australia more than any other state because of our low migration rate, albeit the last few years have been very good. But we need increase in population of the young who are going to be taxpayers for the next 2 to 3 decades, in a sense to look after the rest of us who the next 2 decades are going to become out of the workforce, so as to maintain our quality of life, our services as we have them currently, and to add to our tax-paying base. It's really important.
And I think it seems very coincidental that it's been in the last 5 years that the state government's really made a push with mining and defence, because if anything's going to drag people into this state, that will probably be it. And I think that strategically they've made a pretty good decision in doing
sure.
that.
And I think I think most people would argue that the last few years, the state government here has been very proactive in attracting new industry and looking to the expansion of our workforce, particularly the younger aged, so as to provide those services that I suggest. So, I think they deserve that credit. What we're arguing now is that we want that maintained at the very least, in fact, potentially increased. And we need some infrastructure now to relate to the land that's going to be available so as to be able to populate or house these increased population.
Sure. I guess, in your opinion, Terry, given the amount of land scarcity that we have, in your opinion, where are house prices going to go? I think there's only one way.
Yeah. I think with our increasing demand for housing, I think it is only going to go one way. The difficulty we have in our 30-year plan, which we favour, by the way, but the difficulty there is that we think that there is still an undersupply of land related to that population. The expectation that over the next 30 years, 70% of our new dwellings are going to be infill, that is, in existing suburbia or in existing inner city, with so many of those new dwellings related to the TODs or serviced areas alongside transport corridors. We favour that, but we see that as going to be a real challenge. To get access to that land, to get access to sufficient parcelling of land is going to be a challenge. And secondly, to overcome the NIMBYism or the reluctance by some of the dwellers in some of those areas to extend the population. Traditionally, Adelaide has not favoured that, and so we see that a real challenge both for the industry, the government and the general community to have those infill areas increase in population. Because without that, we're just going to have the city getting skinnier and skinnier and longer, particularly to the north.
Well, Terry, when looking at land supply issues, one of the things that I found interesting was comparing America to Australia. I think everyone who knows anything about America knows that they've truly mastered urban sprawl, as opposed to Australia, where we're really constricting our land and keeping it within an urban boundary. Now, in 2005, or even now, I guess, if you look at the landmass of Australia and America, the land masses between the two countries are very similar. In fact, Australia has about 80% of the landmass of America. So we're not talking about Russia compared to Tasmania. We're talking about two countries that have very similar land masses. If you look at the population, however, America has about 14 times the population. You would look at this and you'd say, well, based on this, you'd expect house prices to potentially be maybe a little higher than Australia. In fact, the house prices in 2005 in Australia, the median house price was about $396,000, whereas in America it was about $213,000. And even when you factor in currency conversion rates, American house prices were considerably lower. And I would suggest that probably a big contributor towards this is the fact that they have so much more land available, and in having so much more, and this is simply due to their planning policies, and having so much more land available, then the consequence of this is that basically it's a lot cheaper, and the cost of housing eventually becomes cheaper as well.
We do need, on the behalf of the general community, to understand that any growth city is going to have some areas which are going to have higher density than what they have now. We have a general reluctance by a lot of our people who live in certain areas to not look at the opportunities that higher density dwellings creates. That is the opportunity for more services, more readily available shops and other entertainment services to the population, more walkability, less driving, more use of public transport. All those could enhance the quality of life for a lot of people if only they would look at it from that perspective.
Sure.
But a lot of people are looking at it from the perspective of more people here is going to reduce the quality of my life. Well, there are, I think we see enough examples around the world would suggest you can have a densification of the community, you can have an enhancement of services, and you can have a general appreciation by the community who live in those areas of an enhanced quality of life because of it. And that's going to be a real challenge for both the industry and governments to do that.
Well, Terry, it's been great speaking with you again today, so thanks so much for that.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, Angela.